So hi, Arjan. So Arjan, is it well pronounced?
Yeah, that's quite well pronounced. You would in Dutch say Arjan.
Arjan.
That's pretty close.
Okay. So I'm already know Schlagboom. You know Schlagboom?
No, I don't.
This is actually in Dutch. This is Schlagboom is Slagboom or Slagboom.
All right, yeah, slagboom.
A Schlagboom. Okay. So now
Yeah,
I'm almost a perfect. I know a native
with
Dutch speaker.
very difficult sound. That's really hard to do for German.
Okay. And what I learned from you is that you started programming with Commodore 64. Why I know that? Because 4 years ago I interviewed you on my blog about Zeev.
Yeah, that's correct.
Your startup, and you told me that you started with Commodore 64. Now, what you did? If you just plug it into the power, what is your first action with Commodore?
So my first action, let me think back. So I still actually remember it when we got home and me and my dad, we bought the Commodore 64. He paid, of course. I was like, I think like 6 or 7 at the time. Mm-hmm. And it was quite amazing to have like a machine that you could input commands to and it would respond to it. And I was quite early on fascinated by that. And I think one of the first things I actually did was trying to program it a little, since we got a book together with the Commodore 64. We was actually programming in BASIC. And I still remember the name of the author. It's Nock van Veen. And it was like the real first introduction for me to like programming and giving commands to a machine. And I think that, like I said, the first thing I did was actually trying some simple 10 print something, 20 go to 10, like quite famous basic thing.
Mm-hmm. With 7?
I think it was about 7, yeah. 7, 6, 7, 6, yeah, something like that.
It is incredible, actually.
Yeah, so quite young at the time, indeed.
Yeah. And why you got the Commodore? What was the story behind?
Well, my grandfather had like a computer before that. It was like a Dutch computer called the Philips 2000. And he was looking at that. But then the Philips 2000 was like really specifically Dutch. So it wasn't quite that interesting for my father. So he wanted for me to have something more that was like more marketable, basically. So if you would be able to work with that, he thought, then you would be later on, you had more knowledge, more marketable knowledge. So he thought like a businessman back then already. So we got the Commodore 64. But it basically started with my grandfather having the Philips 2000.
Okay, this is actually an interesting story. And what did you do with that? So you stick with the Commodore, or were you fascinated by that, or what was the story behind?
So I was quite fascinated with that indeed. So I started, like I said, with BASIC. Mm-hmm. And the beautiful thing of the Commodore 64 was that when you powered it on, you got right into a programming environment. It was like the first thing that came up. And from the programming environment, the BASIC interpreter, you could load games or you could do something else. But the initial thing where you landed in was the programming environment. So that was really inviting to program. So the first thing I did after regular BASIC was Simon's BASIC. That was like a variant on the standard BASIC.
Science BASIC, you said?
No, it's the Simon's.
Simon's, okay.
Yeah, so from the name Simon, mm-hmm. and then Simon's BASIC. Mm-hmm. And you could do a lot more things there. It had more support for graphics, I remember. Mm-hmm. So I fiddled around a little bit with that.
But you had to load it via tape, right?
I think so, yeah. So I did have a floppy drive as well. So they were quite rare at the time, or relatively rare for the Commodore 64, just at the beginning. But we did have a floppy disk. And at some point, it might have come on floppy, I think. So the big 5 1/4 inch ones.
I tried in one point of time GW BASIC. So I never heard about Simon BASIC, but GW BASIC I remember somehow. I don't know what it was, but I did something with it.
Yeah, GW BASIC. that rings a bell as well. So at some point, I got an Amiga, a Commodore Amiga. So I stuck with the brand Commodore.
500?
No, I got the 2000.
Wow. Okay.
And then the 2000 was later on upgraded to basically the 2500, since I got the turbo board, which was like a Motorola 8630 processor, which you could like plug into the system, and then you had like a more powerful computer. And I had the PC emulator on that as well. So, and then like on the PC emulator, you had this GW Basic. So I kind of remember it from that.
Okay. But the Amiga 2000 was like, the graphics were incredible for that time. I remember this was like, like an alien quality.
Yeah, it was like absolutely great. So in the beginning, you had like this ham mode, hold and modify, where you had like 4096 colors, and it was basically unheard of. Like all the other computers, you had like 16 colors, or maybe even less, like 8 with the CGA on the PC, and everything was quite smooth on the Amiga as well. So like graphics scrolled quite smoothly, and the sprites were quite big compared to other computers. So that was really a nice computer to have at the time.
And what you did with the Amiga?
So with the Amiga, I did some programming as well. So I was actually still using my Commodore 64 at the same time, since I did some assembly on that. And I hadn't quite moved on the Amiga to assembly. So I was not that much into programming at that point, since the Amiga was so great for computer games. I was kind of drawn into that for a moment, being like a 8 or 9-year-old boy or something.
What was your favorite game?
I think you had this shooting game. I think it was Xenon. I was quite into that. Then you had this game, Shadow of the Beast, which was quite
cool,
quite fancy. I remember that. And I think there was this sort of Conan or something. I don't quite remember the name. And Rocket Ranger was quite fancy as well. And then a lot more. But I think those were my favorite ones.
Okay, and when you started programming then, so you enjoyed the games a bit, and then what did you remember, the hacking fascination again?
Yeah, so I had the Amiga back then, and the Commodore 64. So I was still doing programming on the Commodore 64, so specifically assembly language. And then at some point, I think I moved a bit to C, the C language. So I started to buy a lot of books about programming for the Amiga. And I was mostly studying the hardware of the Amiga as well. So
but why you did it? So what was your motivation? So was it, how you got the idea, to start with C?
Well, I think it was just the default thing to programming. So like if you got all the programming books about the Amiga, so specifically the hardware books that had like examples in code, they mostly used C for that.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't quite the case that, there's a lot of languages out there, let's choose C. It was more like that the programming books at the time, they just had all the examples in C. So I kind of looked at that. But then in the beginning, I remember it was quite weird for me to have like a main function, and I was quite puzzled by that, I remember. So it seems so easy now, like, you have an entry function and you start with that. But then at the time, I was still used to a bit assembly and to basic. And then just the entire idea of a main function, I don't know why really, but I remember it being weird to me.
Yeah, I actually remember that Java was criticized because of the main function. That is really hard to learn for beginners, because we have the concept of the main functions. It's okay. I mean, it's not that hard, but you're absolutely right. If you started, with programming and there is a main function. So what I ask myself, why the name main? Why not start or whatever? So why main? It's a complete strange name, actually.
Yeah, so that was indeed. So I kind of remember that. And when of course, about the main function, then there's nothing difficult about it. But I vividly remember that I found this difficult at the beginning.
Hey, when you wrote the last time a main function, do you remember that right now?
Well, not that often indeed. Like almost rarely these days. Like if you would program something from scratch.
Yeah. Usually to try something out, I prefer unit tests. And
yeah, indeed.
Yeah, it's faster.
Indeed, yeah. You do a quick unit test. You might use the REPL thing in JDK 9 and onwards.
Yeah, exactly.
And quite often it's like a really cheap and simple way to just bang in some code and test it within like a Java environment. It's just basically creating a servlet, deploying the servlet, and then just typing some code from there.
But you got the main function, I guess. So you were able to understand that, and then you implemented some C programs. And then you stick with C and then move to Java. On what was the story to you more, or what was actually your first reasonable program?
Okay, so my first reasonable program, I remember it to be like a kind of database kind of thing, like a file-based database, data storage thing. So my memory is a bit lapping there, so I can't quite remember it. But I do remember that I started with it. I implemented these things, and I didn't use any version control at the time. So I had like all these version 1 file and version 2 files.
Of course, yeah.
To keep the versions apart. At the time, I had like no idea about version control. And so from memory, it was like a kind of database.
But
thing.
What you stored, you know this?
Come again?
What you wanted to store in the database? You had a use case or idea?
I don't think so. I think I was just a kid trying out some things. And for some reason, I found it nice to store. It might be nodes. It might have been my progress in Judo at the time, or something like that.
Okay. Funny thing is, I started with Turbo Pascal because this was the default language on the 8086, I think. And one of the first programs was also a database. I tried to store something on the disk, and I think because back then everything was ephemeral, right? So it was not like a usual concept that if you just restart the computer, everything disappears. It's more or less like Docker or serverless environment, right?
Yeah.
So and this was like I really was into persistence in database because I thought, okay, now something can persist on the disk. And what I tried to do is to store the expenses, but I didn't have any. But the idea that I can maintain my expenses in a database, this was actually one of the first programs I remember.
Yeah, so indeed, yeah, I think I had expenses as well. Yeah, so like as a kid, I was quite organized. So I had like expenses for buying like a comic or buying like a transformer. I was way into transformers at the time as a 8-year-old boy, and I would note them all down on a piece of paper, and that might have been the initial spark to start something like that. So besides the database program, I think I also coded a small adventure kind of game, but that I think I did, and I even programmed in like an animation kind of thing where I think you had like 2 characters that entered the screen.
Cool.
And it's the typical, do you want to go north, do you want to go south?
Yeah.
And then you entered into a forest or something, and there was a bear in the forest, and he threw like a coconut from the tree or something, and then like an anime made it the thing falling down.
Extremely cool. So we will have to ask you Larry Ellison about his first, application. Probably it's also expenses.
It might well be indeed, yeah. So, so as a kid, I was quite businesslike at some point.
Wow.
So that was quite funny. I even had like, you had this market thing, this called a free market in Dutch, where basically kids, they sell goods on the street on a given day. It's typically Queen's Day in the Netherlands, but there's other days as well. And I had kind of set up an organization with kids. So
wow.
it was like hilarious. Of course, you can't take it too seriously.
But you are the CEO, of course, right?
Yeah, of course. And I had like 5 between big quotes employees.
Mm-hmm.
And using the Commodore 64 again, we printed like a letter that we posted around town for to ask people about old stuff that they didn't use anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And then we posted all these letters around the neighborhood.
It's almost a Mark Twain story, almost, right?
It's almost a bit like that indeed. Yeah. And then like I kept inventory as well. So then we had like, say, 20 cups, 30 plates. And then I had storage with all the kids. There was, of course, under the bed in the bedrooms or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So then I had like, one of my friends was called Hendrik. And then he had like 30 plates, for instance. And then my other friend, he's called Gijs. He had like 30 cups or something. And then I would like keep that in the inventory. And that was like really nice at the time.
Perfect. And how you started with Java? Yeah, I remember you on the interview, you mentioned your sister.
Yeah, so indeed, I think that was actually the first time I actually touched Java. So I was back then into C++. Mm-hmm. So I think we got an old SGI computer before that, like the Indy 4000, I think. I forgot the name exactly. Mm-hmm. So I was doing some C++ on that. And then my sister had an assignment for her math class where she had to do some recursive Java programming. Mm-hmm. And
which version was it? JDK 1.0, I guess, right?
Yeah, it has to be JDK 1.0. I think this was in 1996-ish.
Yeah, 1.0, something like that.
Yeah, so she was at the University of Amsterdam, or the VU actually, the Vrije Universiteit. And then they started to use Java quite early on. And I had to help her out with that.
Cool. And then you like Java or you didn't like that? What was the,
Yeah, so at the beginning I was still more into C++. So I continued with that. So I programmed a few games in that again. Cool. So like this 4 in a row game, I programmed that. Some other stuff that I can't quite recall at the moment. And then there's a certain point, like when I went to university, there were some classes using Java there. Mm-hmm. The main language at the university I was at was the Leiden University. Was C++. I was still mostly doing C++. Mm-hmm. Then I had some side jobs as a student at the time, which was C++ again. So they were mostly Windows Forms kind of apps. I think it did something with advertising even back then, where you had to scan things, whether like an advertisement was placed on the internet or so, and then you had to scrape web pages to see if it would, if the advertisement would be there. And I programmed that in C++ still at the time. And then eventually, when I left the university, I started at this startup company too. It's called N4N. And they used Java, and it's only then that I like really switched over to Java.
What was the idea of the startup?
Okay, so the startup was basically a bit related to the advertisement work I did before with the C++ application. So a friend of mine, this old you friend again, this Gijs I mentioned, he was a friend of the owner of the startup, and they needed a developer. So I started to work with them. And the idea was basically putting advertisements on websites.
Okay.
So it's called affiliate marketing, where you just have like an affiliate who's the one putting the advertisement on. Then there's the network, and then there's an advertiser or a merchant who has the advertisements to be placed on the affiliate websites.
And which application server was it, or you built some, of course, from scratch one?
No, so at the time we used Orion.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it was from
Sweden.
It's the Swedish or the I think it was from Norway.
No, I think it was from Sweden because Oracle bought Orion server, and this was the first OC4J. And the Oracle Java manager was from the Orion company, I think.
Oh, really?
So there were two students actually who founded the Orion company.
Yeah. So I remember it was like two guys indeed. Yeah, it was like quite small at the time. There were just two persons there.
But really nice, very fast, and there was even a user interface and an admin interface. I remember.
So I didn't use the interface, to be honest. So
I just tried that. So I was fast. I don't know why, but I really like the Orion server. I used the Java web server a lot. Then the JBoss, of course, or the EJB boss was the first name.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, very shortly. Then JBoss and later BA. But I used at the beginning also Orion and even Jigsaw. So Jigsaw was the servlet container from Apache.
Oh, really? So I haven't used that. So we just used at that point Orion, and I think I remember that since we were like an advertising network, we got like a lot of clicks and views, relatively speaking. That this was like quite a number of hits, and at that point we did tests with Tomcat now and then, and it would like always crash on the load. Mm-hmm. So this was 2002, 2003, and Tomcat was, I think it was like version 3 or so back then.
Mm-hmm. But the first Tomcat, I think it was donated by Sun, and the name was Java Web Servlet Development Kit, JWSDK.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, and I worked with that. I forgot about that. So you mentioned Tomcat right now. And then in one point, Sun donated that to Apache or something like this, and then Tomcat started.
Yeah, indeed. So it was kind of the reference implementation for Servlet.
Exactly.
And then it went to Apache. Mm-hmm. And then later on, Glassfish reused parts of Tomcat again. Mm-hmm. So even to this day, large parts of Tomcat and the Apache software is still within Glassfish and still within Piara.
Yeah, absolutely. And the history was even more exciting because the Java web server was the commercial server from Sun. And I think parts of that were also the root of the server was also the JWSDK and then the Tomcat. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's quite related to each other.
Yeah, and now Piara, of course, also has no roots back then to Tomcat and JWSDK.
Yeah, so it goes back a long time. And you quite often see this in the Piara source code, where you get references to the Sun 1 application server. There's references to Glassfish. Mm-hmm. So there's all this history that's still in the source code.
Yeah, and in the very, very rare cases, you could see something like this in stack traces as well, right?
Yeah. I always remember talking about stack traces, that with Orion, in the stack traces, there was always this Evermind thing. And I always wondered about that. How did they come to that name, Evermind? Uh-huh. So I never quite found out, to be honest. But I remember that in the Orion stack traces.
Yeah. And what I remember right now is another application server, which I completely forgot, was Trifork.
Trifork, yeah, that rings a bell. So I haven't used it.
Also interesting one. But now, what really surprised me, so you have a C background. You started programming with 6 or 7 in BASIC. So I think you understand pick, poke, and hardware. Now, you should actually hate Java EE. So regarding your history, it's like, hey, Java is way too, waste of memory, performance, or whatever. It's bloated. I just like to have, my optimized low-level Java code. Now the question to you, why you like Java EE?
Okay, well, it was like absolutely not the case that I hate it.
This surprises me because usually, the low-level guys don't like Java EE because there's too much magic or whatever, but you are different somehow.
Yeah, like absolutely not the case. I was quite intrigued at the beginning by having like this overarching framework where like a lot of services were there. So I think this was a bit related to my interest at the time for operating systems. So one of the things I wanted to do when I was still studying was like move into operating systems. So that was my initial target, so to speak. And Java EE bit reminded me like that. It was like a kind of higher level operating system like thing with a lot of services being there. So that kind of intrigued me, and it was like absolutely not the case that this is bloated, this is too high level. More like the opposite, actually.
Yeah, and what's funny, what I sometimes telling my clients is, like for me, the Java E stuff or J2E back then is like the operating system for my business logic. So I don't like, to focus on the low-level stuff. I just focus on my business logic, and I consider Java E as being the operating system. So it seems like you have a very similar point of view.
Yeah, indeed. And like it was the same with the JVM at the time. So like the JVM was a kind of a service environment for your code. And then Java EE, I felt it was a bit like an extended VM kind of thing. So it's,
Yes, exactly. So for me as well. So so we start with JVM, and if we do something with server, like extends the JVM. That's also my point of view.
Extends the JVM. It's a bit like operating system like, and this was my goal to get into at the time. So it's kind of appealed to me, really.
And you stick with Java E since then with the Orion server?
Yeah, so I basically stuck with that. So I do remember in the beginning that coming from a C++ background, I felt a bit worried at first to do a lot of method calls. So like I had learned like way back in the days of the Commodore 64 that method call was quite expensive thing, so you should avoid doing too many of them. Mm-hmm. So this was one of the first things I had to unlearn really in Java. It didn't matter that much, especially when Hotspot came around.
I remember one thing. I was in a project with C developers, and they managed to write a Java method, and it was so large that the compiler couldn't compile the method.
Yeah, so
I forgot that there is a boundary. I think it cannot be larger than 50K or something like this, and if the method is larger than this, then the compiler won't compile the method.
All right, yeah, I could imagine that indeed, yeah.
This was like, I don't know, 10 years ago, but I remember it's saying, I don't like to call methods. This was exactly the same. They tried to put as much as possible to one method, to be faster without measuring, of course.
Of course, without measuring. Yeah. So I do actually know that in the days of the Commodore 64, like every call was, and everything you did was measured a lot. Just like the Commodore 64 was incredibly slow by today's standards. Mm-hmm. And you would basically count every cycle of every instruction that you did. So you had like a bunch of commands like LDA, STA, which would like move things around in memory. Mm-hmm. And then you would, in your code, next to each piece of code, you would write down how many cycles it would take to execute. And then you would try to keep the amount of cycles beneath a certain threshold. And if you went over it, you had to like remove some code or like be a bit more clever about things. That was like really the different way of reasoning about the code and performance.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And how long you stick with the Orion server? So, or when you left the startup, or?
Yeah, so the Orion server was, I think we used it basically until Oracle bought it over, and then like no new versions came out anymore. Mm-hmm. From the top of my head, it was 2.0.3 or something, or 2.0.4. I might be mistaken, but it was something like that. And then we started to move to Tomcat. Mm-hmm. We had, like I said, we had tried Tomcat before, but it always crashed on the load. And then at that point, I think it was Tomcat 4 or so, we again tried it. And for the first time, it didn't crash when on the load. So that was good. And
how much load did you had? So was it how many transactions per second? Do you have any number? So, or could you just estimate that?
It's a very good question. Since yes, we did a lot of performance testing at the time, and we always had a charts of how many views per second we could do. Mm-hmm. But this is about 15 odd years ago. So
yeah, but roughly estimate would be interesting, right? How the technology changes.
I think we did like maybe 3 views per second or something. Mm-hmm. per server, something like that.
And you had a cluster of servers?
We had a couple of servers, not too many. We were just a small startup at then. I think we had like 2 or 3 of the servers that received the views and the clicks. And then we had only 1 server for the UI, and I think 1 server for the database with a hot standby at the time. So that was something like that. And it did indeed crash before with Tomcat, and then at some point, like I said, I think it was Tomcat 4. It didn't crash anymore, and then we slowly started to migrate to Tomcat.
And then you stick with Tomcat?
Yeah, so then we stuck with Tomcat for a while. So it was a relatively easy migration since we actually at the time didn't use many of the G2EE functions. So it was mostly servlet, JSP that we used.
And struts probably, right?
No, we hadn't struts. It was just plain JSP.
Cool.
So there was like basically no external framework really. I think we did use Hibernate probably. And way in the beginning it was just plain JDBC. So the company started as a startup, of course, and the developers at the time, they weren't that advanced really, so they had to learn things about Java still. So it was basically just simple servlets, JSPs, JDBC. So at that point, not even Hibernate, just pure basics.
When you left the startup, or you just so what was the story after the startup?
Yeah, so
when you left them, or why?
So the story after the startup was that I stayed with them for quite a long time, until 2011ish, something like that.
So this was no more a startup. So this was so the company was actually successful.
Yeah, the company was actually quite successful. So we became one of the biggest affiliate networks in the Netherlands, and we were like in the fast forward list. I forgot the exact name of promising companies, promising startups, what have you. And like we started in this really old building, but it wasn't like even a proper office. We were basically like in a school class. And we quite often had the case that like students would knock on the door and asking if there was some class starting here. No, we're a company. You know?
That's nice.
So that was quite low key, so to speak, like really humble beginnings. And then at some point the company started to grow, and we hired some more staff, and then the building got demolished because it was so old. It was actually a funny thing. It was voted the ugliest building in Amsterdam that we've been. So for the audience who's from Amsterdam, it was the Wieboudhuis that we were in. It was like a really ugly building, and then it got torn down. So we moved to a building down the road.
With or without Slagboom?
Actually, the other building that we went to, it was the old Parooltoren, which was the big office building where the newspaper was in before. It had a slagboom indeed, yeah.
Very good. Okay, so you see the most valuable Dutch word I learned. So
yeah,
I can apply it everywhere. Yeah,
you can use it everywhere indeed.
This is why I remember, because in German, Schlag is like hit, and boom is just boom. It's like hit boom. But it's of course this bomb is 3. I learned, but for me it's easy to remember. It's just funny. And you kept using Tomcat until the end, or?
No, we at some point. Let me see. I think around 2007ish, we started to look at some more advanced things. So we had the Tomcat code with all those separate libraries in our application, and we wanted to professionalize a little. So we moved to JAAS at the time, and the thing was to basically cut down on the amount of libraries that we were using. So at the time we did use JSF, we did use Hibernate.
Mm-hmm.
We even used the beta pre-versions of JPA. So it was a bit of a weird thing, but the APIs were still changing, and we were already coding against it. So that was quite an interesting time.
That's interesting because, in around 2006, I remember the days, there was also a movement from application servers back to Tomcat, which was really funny for me because many architects claimed, they have lightweight servers, which was Tomcat, and they forgot to mention that the war was like a half a gig,
Yeah, exactly.
So it was always fun. It's like, hey, we have a lightweight server. It's like, how big is your war? Half a gig. It's like, okay, how long does deployment take? It's like, okay, I don't know, the 10 minutes. Like, okay, have fun.
Yeah, indeed. So it wasn't lightweight at all, of course, since like all the jars were there, and especially we weren't using Maven at the time, and Maven had quite a bit of issues back then.
Yeah, Maven 1, it was like programming in XML almost.
Yeah, so that was quite horrible. So, but the other side of the coin was that with the Tomcat of the day and just using Nscripts, you had to sort out all the dependencies yourself. So we had, as I mentioned, Hibernate, and then Hibernate had like 12 jars as dependencies, and you manually had to keep them up to date. And like even worse, we had our lib folder started to grow, and there were dependencies in there that we had like no idea where they came from. So there was like a jar called STBBC or something, and we were like, why is this jar over there? And it took a long time to sort out where every jar was being used for. And
this is not the difference to my current project I review. Sometimes I know hundreds of Maven dependencies. I ask why they are there. No one knows. It's like, okay.
Yeah. So with Maven, it becomes a little bit easier since you have only the top level dependencies in the PALM and not the
too easy, I would claim.
That's almost too easy indeed. Yeah. So that's of course the other side of the coin again. But you can kind of see what's the top level dependencies, but with just a plain lib folder, you have like 100 jar files there. You like no idea which jar file belongs to which other or which codes he uses which one. So that was quite difficult.
And were you happy with the migration from Tomcat to JBoss? So afterwards, so was it easier, simpler? So were the developers satisfied?
Yeah, so we were quite happy with it, indeed. So the migration wasn't even that difficult, really. So we were using a bunch of the same dependencies already that JBoss was using, like Hibernate and Mahara. So that wasn't that difficult. So we thought it would be like a major operation. And actually, it took us, I think, 2 or 3 weeks or so to migrate over.
Okay.
It wasn't that bad, really.
So why you left the company?
Well, actually, in the beginning, I didn't quite left the company, but we were taken over by another company. So that was Sanox DE, a German company.
I know, they are from Berlin, I think.
Yeah, they're from Berlin, indeed. So I basically worked for them for a couple of years.
I also, they invited me for some architecture workshops a few years ago, I remember.
Oh, really? So then we probably could have almost met them since I was in Berlin at the time. Yeah, so that was quite interesting. So they bought us, and so then I essentially worked for Sanox for some time, and we had to migrate our customer base to their platform, and so that was a big job. And then we did something else, like a data parser that we did, like an XML feed parser.
And they used the whole time Java EE stuff, right?
Yeah, so it remained on Java EE indeed. So Sanox had like a really big stack where they used a lot of different technologies. But we were just sticking to plain Java EE.
Exactly.
And so with them, it's like it really showed the problem when you do have like a lot of technology. So like one day a developer wanted to use JWT and he started to use it. Then like they bought another company and it happened to be using Ruby, I think, and they had Perl code as well. And then they hired a consultancy company who did a project in portlets, I think. Mm-hmm. So they had like this really divided stack, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And it was quite difficult to share code and to share knowledge between like all those different stacks of technology that they were using.
Yeah, but you could sell it as polyglot programming, right?
You could see it as that, yeah.
So, sometimes it is people at conferences sell it as a feature, but I see this is complete mess in project. It's the whole polyglot programming. I think the best thing you can get is have one language for everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, and regardless what it is, it doesn't have to be Java. I of course like Java, but and the whole polyglot programming disappeared from conferences nowadays. But a few years ago, it was a huge hit. Like use the right language for the job, and say, okay, this is a consultant paradise.
Yeah, so quite often it hasn't anything to do with the right tool for the right job. Of course, people would tout it as that, but it's just basically using what you think is good or what you think is cool. And
these days, exactly what is cool. This is actually the driver.
Yeah, that's quite often the drive. Or sometimes it's just what somebody happens to know. Like when a person comes into the company, or he may come in or she via like a takeover, and the person just happens to know Ruby or happens to know Perl. Mm-hmm. They tend to keep using that. So that's another reason for this thing to happen.
And so you left Xanox one point of time, right?
Yeah, so indeed. So like I said, for Xanox, we did this data feed parser thing, mm-hmm. Which was like this big engine to parse really, really big XML files. Mm-hmm. Some of the files were like 2 or 4 gigabytes in size. And we did this like in parallel. So we had like a lot of really clever code that did a lot of parallel operations, a lot of optimizations. So after we finished that, we thought, okay, well, what are we going to do next? So are we going to continue within Xanox, or are we going to do something else? And then basically the team that was still in the Netherlands, but then working for Xanox, they kind of thought, okay, well, we could move over to Berlin. Some guys indeed did. They moved over to Berlin. Other people thought, okay, well, no, I want to stay here in the Netherlands. Then Xanox said, okay, well, we don't really want a big development team in the Netherlands. So we started to see what the options were. And then at some point, a team of about 9 people, they thought, okay, well, we can just found a new company, and that's what Sieve became.
And you have still Sieve?
Well, Sieve is still operational, so I'm not working with Sieve anymore. Mm-hmm. But the website is actually still up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, double check that. It still works. And this was your company, Sieve, or was it? What was it?
Yeah, so Sieve, it wasn't so much my company per se. We founded Sieve with about 10 people, so I had just some shares in the company. But it was, like a co-founded company. We founded Sieve with this group of people, and basically all the people came from Xanox. This was the group, basically the Amsterdam-based development group who left Xanox, everybody together, and then we founded Sieve.
And what happened with the company? Then I interviewed you, I think, in 2015 about the architecture of Sieve, and you were really happy with the productivity of Java EE and the performance. And and then the company dissolved, or what's?
Yeah, well, so the thing with a platform like Sieve is that you don't get income from day one. You basically try to build up a really large user base, mm-hmm. and then in some way you want to monetize that. You try to monetize it. Mm-hmm. So we did get a lot of users. So the users were like increasing almost day by day. Mm-hmm. Monetize it at some point. So the income we were not quite happy with that. Mm-hmm. So what we tried to do is that you have like all the links on Sieve, all the lists of links, and when people click on them and the link happens to go to like a company's website or an advertiser's website, you get like this affiliate reward, mm-hmm. which is quite close to the model we had at Serrano's and before that at M4N. Mm-hmm. And we basically applied that to Sieve. But despite that, the income was still not that good, really. So what we then did after that, we kind of extracted this affiliate engine from the Sieve platform, and then we created that into a separate project. It was called Link Pizza. And with Link Pizza, basically other companies could use the same technology that Sieve used on their own website. But still, the income wasn't that good, really. So at some point, we started to do some consultancy work. So basically, work for the different company to just get some income for our main company. So then I worked for about a year for this UK-based company, Mercury One. And then at that point, I thought, okay, well, I don't really want to go back to the Link Pizza code. I have done that for a long time. I want to try something else. And that's when I saw the advertisement for the job advert for Piara. And at the same time, like for the last 5 or 6 years before that, I was getting more and more involved with Java EE, with the specifications, with the blog and what have you. So at that point, I thought, okay, well, this is actually a good opportunity. Let me leave Link Pizza and Sieve and just start something else.
When was it?
Come again?
When was it?
Oh yeah, I think that was in 1.5 years ago, in 2017.
That's interesting. I didn't know that you actually working for Piara.
Okay.
It's funny. So you are now Piara employee, right?
Yeah. So I now work for Piara indeed, mm-hmm. And it's so in the beginning it wasn't that different for me, but it was a bit getting used to, since I was quite used to work with the Sieve team, which was before the Serrano's team. And then like starting with a new company, basically on my own, without a team, I was quite used to. Mm-hmm. That was quite different for the first few months.
And what do you do at Piara? What are your tasks?
Okay, so like I'm a tech lead at Piara, mm-hmm. and basically do a lot of different things. So I work on the core server. I'm mostly responsible for the specification work, so that's Jakarta EE now, mm-hmm. Making sure that everything happens to there, what we need to do. I do work on other things as well within the company, so like the Eclipse plugins that we have for Piara. Mm-hmm. I work on these two. The Archelion plugins, I've worked on them as well. So the company is still small enough to do a lot of different things within the company.
Yeah, very cool. So it's actually a really exciting job.
Yeah, so that's really quite exciting indeed. Yeah.
Cool. So I know you from your spec work actually. So I didn't know that you're working for Piara. I know you from the JSR 375 and from all the other security work. The question is, why you like the whole authentication and authorization? Was it required for your previous jobs to know about that, or is somehow you really like authentication and authorization?
Okay, yeah. So that's a funny story indeed. So with M4N, which I started first, the architecture, the security architecture at first was like really wobbly, so to speak. It was like really not that well thought out, the first versions. And then later on we did improve upon it, but it was like a whole bunch of homemade code, so it was quite difficult to get into. Then when we moved to Sieve at that point, I thought, okay, well, there's this JASPIC API. I'd heard about that. So I thought, okay, well, let's just use And we don't have to maintain all the homemade security code that we did before. But then we started to use JASPIC, and it appeared to be quite badly documented. And it appeared to be quite broken in many implementations. So I was like really surprised about that. So I tried JBoss, and a lot of things that should work according to the spec, they just didn't work, and it crashed all the time. I thought, okay, well, this is like really weird. So I tried some other services as well just to verify. And it kind of didn't work either. So I got kind of intrigued by that at the same time. So on one hand, I was a bit annoyed about it. So having this spec in Java EE, but it's just not working. On the other hand, I was intrigued by it. So I thought, well, let's see what it needs to be workable. And that's basically how I rolled into it.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't quite by choice. It just happened.
It was like 2017, I guess, right?
For JASPIC, it was 2013 when we started SIEV.
SIEV, okay. And so JASPIC is Java Authentication Service Provider Interface. It's just about the authentication, right?
No, so that's just the authentication indeed.
But now we have you here. So in Java EE, we have lots of things. So in Java SE, we have JAAS, so Java Authorization and Authorization Service, I think, right? So this is the name, or API, Java Authentication API and Authorization Service, right? This is the name.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. Then we have the JAAC, Java Authorization Container Contract, which started actually before JASPIC. So it seems like Java EE started with the authorization and then came the authentication.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, and then we got JASPIC. And but this specification are usually hidden. So as a Java EE developer, you will probably see in WebXML like the protected resources where you can say, okay, I would like to protect this URI. So I think I can ask you the question. So what actually happened? So imagine I have very basic form authentication. So just standard servlets. I have a username and password, and I send this data to the server, and I say, let's say basic authentication, not form rather than basic is more interesting. So the servlet engine will parse the base64 stream and extract username and password. What happens then?
Yeah, so what happens is that a couple of things happen. So at first there's a security surface, basically, like an entrance point, like in Tomcat, it would be the realm. It would look at the requests, and it would call into the authorization service first to see if the request is protected or not, or whether the data confidentiality is correct. So it would first start with an authorization check. So if it's required to authenticate...
sorry to interrupt you, but I think at the start time, the JAAC stuff, Java Authorization Container Contract, hits in because it parses the deployment descriptors and provides the information for your service right now, right?
Yeah. So if you're in a Java EE environment, so that's not, of course, Tomcat, but it can be Tom EE or Payara, what have you, then it would indeed parse the web.xml to find all the constraints. And in plain Tomcat, the constraints are parsed and kept into memory. And if you add JAAC to it, it kind of does the same thing. It gets the already parsed constraints from whatever server you have, and then it translates them to a set of permissions, and those permission instances are standardized.
And who is in charge of parsing them? So JAAC provides this mapping between deployment descriptors and the instances.
Well, it's typically the server. So the server in servlet containers, they already have to parse web.xml and the web fragment and the related annotation. So that kind of already happened. So the only thing that happens is that there's this little bit of in-between code that does the translation from the set of constraints that have been extracted from the descriptors into this standardized set of permissions.
Mm-hmm.
So the code is actually not that big, really.
Mm-hmm.
And then the permissions are received by a JAAC configuration provider.
Mm-hmm.
And the configuration provider is basically a repository, a bit like an identity store in Java EE security,
mm-hmm.
but then specifically to hold permissions.
Mm-hmm.
And this configuration provider, it can be provided by the user, it's pluggable, but the server should also provide a default implementation of that.
Mm-hmm. So if the developer will replace the configuration provider, you could parse, instead you could replace WebXML with your own format, right?
Yeah, so essentially. So it would still, like the server would still parse WebXML. It would
mm-hmm.
still extract all the constraints,
mm-hmm.
but then the constraints are translated to these permissions,
mm-hmm.
and the permissions are being received by your own configuration provider. Mm-hmm. And then there's this component coupled to it. It's called the policy. Mm-hmm. It's the same as in Java SE. Mm-hmm. And the policy is what makes the actual authorization decisions. And the policy is supposed to look at the permissions that have been given to it by the server. Mm-hmm. So it's basically a stream of constraints in WebXML, then a collection of permissions, mm-hmm. and then the policy looking at this collection of permissions and then making an authorization decision.
Mm-hmm. And right now we only have the Servlet API and JAAC.
Yeah, so that's only the Servlet API and JAAC. So JAAC...
And JAAS. Could we use JAAS at this point of time?
Well, JAAS is, in that sense, it's related to it. And also not related to it. So it gets a bit complicated there. So what the architects of Java EE tried to do in the beginning, and that's mostly Ron Mosilla, who was the original guy at Sun, who did a lot of work there. He tried to align those models, the Java SE security model and the Java EE security model. So JAAC uses a lot of JAAS types, mm-hmm. but it's not JAAS itself. So JAAS is more about code security. It's about checking what code is allowed to do. And that's mostly used when you run untrusted code. So like when you download an applet or a Java WebStart application, mm-hmm. then the code is foreign and the computer is yours. And you want to protect your own computer against the foreign code. Mm-hmm. In JAAC and JASPIC and Java EE in general, it's the other way around. So your code is trusted. You, of course, run and trust your own code, but then the user is not trusted. So it's basically a code-based security versus a principle-based security. Mm-hmm. So that's a big difference. And the thing that JAAC uses from JAAS is basically the permission instances, mm-hmm. The subject type, and that's about it. So it's not using a lot. It's just using some types mm-hmm. from it. One of the complicated things is, though, that some of those types were originally intended for this code security thing. JAAC still wants to have those as the input, and it feels a bit weird at sometimes. So you have to create a code source instance, and a code source has nothing to do with the principle. So everything has to be null and empty, and you only use this to pass in the principles to policy.
Could we see the JAAC as a facade around JAAS?
A little, yeah. So a little. So the policy.
Just the types. So the JAAS donates the types, some types to JAAC, right? So
yeah.
Some return values or method parameters are come from JAAS.
Yeah. So you could see that. So like the policy is of course really a Java SE type, and JAAC depends on the policy. The configuration the provider is specifically from JAAC. And a couple of the permissions that JAAC checks for those are all JAAC specific, but the permission type itself comes from JAAS and Java SE.
So now we have JAAC and JAAS. What about JASPIC? So when JASPIC kicks in?
Yeah, so JASPIC is basically the authentication mechanism. So it's basically the thing that interacts with the environment, which is the caller, the user, and the server. So you could see it if you compare it to a model view controller architecture, then JASPIC would be the controller. So JASPIC inspects the HTTP request. It can extract headers from it. It can look at the request parameters. It can send challenges back to the user. It can send a response. So that's basically what JASPIC is about.
So the JASPIC is probably used in the JWT microprofile implementation, right?
Technically, it's not, since like my microprofile is, how to say, it's assuming that there is some security implementation, but it doesn't say what security implementation is there. But practically, the thing that JWT authentication microprofile does is implement an authentication mechanism. And that's exactly what JASPIC is used for.
Okay. So I thought that they're using behind the scenes the JASPIC spec.
So no, they don't.
But they could, right?
Yeah, they could, absolutely. So I kind of argued for that in the beginning. But microprofile is only based on JAAS. JAAS is, of course, in practice almost always used with servlets, but it doesn't need to be. And JASPIC has, at the moment, only servlet container profile. It doesn't have a JAAS container profile.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay.
So it's very close. Everything is practically like really close. And in Piara, it has indeed been implemented based on JASPIC and Java EE security. But it doesn't have to be.
Of course. So Piara uses JASPIC for JWT, right?
Yeah. So JWT authentication in microprofile on Piara is based on Java EE security, and of course Java EE security is based on JASPIC.
Yeah, this was the next question because we have the JSR 375, right? This is the Java EE security, the new one, the Java 8 security. And I thought actually if you have JSR 375, you could actually implement JWT by yourself, right? Because you have the HTTP authentication mechanism.
Yeah.
You could parse the JWT and then you can do whatever you like.
Yeah, so that's exactly how we implemented it in Piara. So there's this JWT authentication mechanism, and it does exactly what you say. Yeah.
So we have the old technology. So we had JASPIC, JAAS, and JAAC. And Java 8 came with this Java EE security authentication. It's called the JSR 375. And it is like a syntactic sugar around the existing specification, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happened is that at some point we looked at JASPIC and we said, okay, well, it's a low-level API. It's not technically not even an API. It's an SPI, which means it's like really low level. It's not really targeted at your regular application developer. So what we thought at first is to extend JASPIC itself and then add the CDI layer to it to make it more user-friendly, to add an HTTP specific types to it. But then things, we weren't quite clear where to put that. So on the one hand, we wanted to keep JASPIC as simple as can be. And on the other hand, we wanted to have this user-friendly thing. And those concerns, they kind of collided with each other. And then after a lot of discussions, like a lot of talks happened behind the scenes before Java EE security was started. And then we decided to create a new spec. And that spec would basically be a layer on top of JASPIC and JAAC. But it mostly does Java EE security. The HTTP authentication mechanism is actually quite close to the SAM, which is the main artifact in JASPIC. But it basically adds HTTP specific types to it. And it adds CDI to it. And it makes the configuration auto-discoverable. So that's the three essentially smallest things, but that make it a lot easier to use.
Yeah, exactly. Let's say I would like to have a token-based authentication, which is just base string. Let's say if the content is not encrypted, anything is 42, I'm in, and something else to 42, I'm not in. How I would implement that with JSR 375?
Yeah, so you would start with an authentication mechanism. And the authentication mechanism would basically only have the validate request method. The other methods are defaulted in its interface, so you don't have to look at it. And you would essentially just do a request get header. And based on the header, you would either proceed, so you would return an OK result, or you would return a denied result. And that's essentially it.
And then I would like to be the principal Duke with the role admin. Yeah,
so the easiest thing to do at that point would be to just instantiate a new principal. There's even like a helper principle for that, caller principle it's called. It would basically just say new caller principle, and you would enter Duke as the first parameter. And that essentially would be it. And the second parameter would be a list of groups that you would be in. And that's everything, really.
And if you would like to pick it from a database, you could inject the realm, right?
So it's not a realm. It's called an identity store.
IdentityStores, sorry.
So the word realm is quite overloaded in Java EE implementation. So in Tomcat, it's essentially a kind of authentication mechanism. And then in Glassfish and Piara, a realm is more to what an identity store is.
There was a huge discussion in the mailing list. I remember how to call it, right? So we had like multiple choices. What would be the right name for it? And for me, Realm is like a database of principles and or of the security store. It's per se, because if you send a basic authentication, there is like a realm pointed to the realm.
Indeed, yeah. So in basic authentication, that's a funny thing that you mentioned it. That's another those things. The realm that you put in WebXML's basic authentication is actually only intended by the spec to be like informative to the user. So it's by spec, it's not really pointing to an identity store or to a database of principles. It happens to be done by Glassfish in that way. That's a bit confusing at times. So the thing is that Java EE, it never really had a very good specification for this database. Servlet and JASPIC, they kind of left this thing open. And then the application server vendors, they kind of started to use the realm element for that, even though it wasn't intended to be used for this.
Yeah, I actually use it in Piara. So you can have JDBC realm and LDAP realm, so you can
Exactly. So that's actually not the spec intended thing. A realm is only used by spec for the basic authentication mechanism. And it's not used officially to say LDAP or JDBC. But of course, in practice, as we know, it is. So that's quite telling that this piece, this identity store piece, was like really missing from Java EE.
And the identity store piece, the API or the interface is fairly easy, right? Fairly basic.
Yeah, that's very basic. So we had, again, we had a huge discussion about that. You might remember it since you were part of that as well in the beginning. And then we had the spec lead at the time, Alex, who had like a really big proposal of an identity store where you had like 20 methods or so, and you could add users, you could add groups, you could get groups and roles from it, and it was like really big. And of course, it's still interesting to have something like that, since you could do standardized user management from the Java EE application. But I wanted to go like way back to the basics. So just have a single method basically that only does this really simple input-output thing. You put in the credentials and you get back the principals and the groups and nothing else. So just focus on this really simple basic thing.
Which was a very good choice, I think.
Yeah, I think it was a very, very good choice indeed. But yeah, there were, of course, with every spec, there are conflicting concerns, there are conflicting ideas, and you have to discuss them, and eventually this idea came out of it.
How big is JAAS R375? So how many interfaces, classes, or is it?
At the moment, it's not that big, actually. I think it's like about 12-ish classes or so.
Yeah, it is very lean and thin, actually.
Something like that. So it's not really that much, to be honest. And it's basically the same or a similar thing holds for JASPIC. JASPIC is really not that big either. It's a few interfaces. There's a few ones that maybe should not have been there, but the base interface, that is the SAM, the Server Authentication Module, is actually quite simple, even though like JASPIC has the name of being complicated and arcane and what have you. But it's actually a bit too simple, and that the fact that it's so simple makes JASPIC a bit more complex, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah. I think this JASPIC is not that natural to parse for a regular developer. For me, the JAAS R375, I look at it, I know what you mean, right? With JASPIC, this is complete different, wording, and the API looks a little bit strange.
Yeah, indeed. So with JASPIC, indeed, the API looks strange, which is why we layered the authentication mechanism on top of it, which is on the one hand still close to JASPIC, so it uses the same method names like a validate request. On the other hand, it uses specific types for things. Like, the idea behind JASPIC was that it was like a really general base authentication mechanism that could be used for servlets, for EGB, for JMS, for JCA, like everything that came into a server, like the inflow security into a server, could theoretically be handled by JASPIC. And that's why the interface is so overly general. So you don't see HTTP request in the interface, you don't see EGB things, you only see objects. Mm-hmm. And of course, that makes it really difficult to parse.
Final question to you. What is the difference between group and roles?
Yeah, so group and roles, that's actually they don't really have to be that different. So people often look at the English words and think like a group is something really big and a role is something really specific, but essentially they're just opaque strings. And a group is being mapped to a role in Java EE. Mm-hmm. They can be the same. So like you can have group foo mapped to a role foo.
And I have to admit, in my project, it's always the same. So a group is always a role. I never had any use case to have something different.
Indeed. So that's basically what Java EE 8 and specifically Java EE security kind of as a hidden thing added to the spec of the full Java EE platform. That's that the one-to-one role mapping is now the default. Mm-hmm. So before that was kind of an open thing. So Java EE had the concept of groups. It's just in the spec. It has the concept of roles, but it never really said, do they have to be mapped to each other? Is it mandatory to map them? Can they be one-to-one? So that's a thing that JAAS R375 added as well, to make this mapping one-to-one by default.
Mm-hmm. So in Payara, we don't have to specify any proprietary descriptors. It just happens, right?
It just happens. So the JBoss actually did this for a long time already. So you never had to map roles in JBoss. They're always one-to-one by default. You can map them optionally, but you didn't have to. Glassfish for a long time was mandatory to map them. The same for WebLogic. Then at some point, Glassfish did add the one-to-one mapping to their proprietary descriptor, the Glassfish minus web.xml. But then you had to, sorry, I stayed the other way around. Payara added it to Glassfish minus web.xml. In Glassfish, you had to set the setting in the admin console. So that was always the difficult thing. So you had to first modify the server in order to have the one-to-one role mapping. It could be done, but you couldn't just deploy a var and have it run. You had to first go into the admin console. So that was a quite important thing for portable applications.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, where people can find you? Some links or pointers to your work?
So basically my main website is at the Omnifaces site. That's Arjan-times omnifaces.org. So that's basically my main place from where I operate. I do have the Omnifaces handle on Twitter, which I share with my friend Bauke. And then I actually have a Arjan Times handle on Twitter as well, but I don't use it that often. I mostly use it from the Omnifaces handle.
Oh, cool.
So those are basically my two main presences on the internet, I think.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, and see you at upcoming conferences somewhere. And I would like to invite you once again to talk about more JSF, authentication, Payara. Now we don't have to introduce anymore, right?
Okay, yeah, that would be cool indeed.
So, okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you too.
Bye.
Right, bye-bye.